Thank you for pressing play on this video. I'm here with Dr. Rosie Kuhn. I'm Nick Fortino, and we are in conversation today. Dr. Rosie Kuhn is a psychologist and a writer and a transformational coach and an artist. And it's great to be here with you.
Thanks, Nick. It's nice to see you again.
We came into contact and had the inspiration to do this interview because we realized that we had this shared interest in the topic of intelligence.
hmm
And you had mentioned to me that you'd been really thinking a lot about spiritual intelligence. And this is not currently in the multiple intelligences theory, which is really one of the broadest theories of intelligence. So,
hmm
spiritual intelligence is not really being recognized in any of the main models of intelligence quite yet. So I think this could be a good opportunity for us to talk about what that is. So will you speak to that?
The words spiritual intelligence came to me when I was talking to a particular individual. We were in a network marketing group and we were discussing, and she was saying, I really like you and I really like Marta. And I don't know why I like you guys better than everybody else.
Hmm.
And the words that came out of my mouth is, well, we have a spiritual intelligence that they don't have, because both of us were, and I didn't even know what I was saying because it was like, just saying it. But that sense that there was a quality of being or quality of presence that was beyond normal 3D consensus reality, that took in grace, kindness, generosity, something bigger than just your normal consensus reality kind of conversation. So that was the beginning of it. And that was before 2000. I graduated in 2001. And so the idea of writing a book on spiritual intelligence started way back then for me. And then I cannot remember the individuals, Dr. Walsh, and I can't remember her first name right now, but
There's
she had talked about, go ahead.
and I'm thinking of the Vaughns, Francis and Roger.
Francis. Yeah, it
Francis
was
Vaughn,
Francis.
is there? Okay, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Francis had talked about spiritual intelligence because at that time it was like, oh, I thought that I made this up. And then it's like, oh no, she's talked about it. And other people have used that term. And it was like, okay. So that's when it just popped up in that way. And then it's like, well, what the heck is that? What
Mm-hmm.
is it that distinguishes that from cognitive intelligence, all of the other intelligences? So that's kind of where this conversation comes in, is like, is it different? Is it part of? What is it?
Yes.
Yeah.
So let's even maybe start with the word spiritual. I think you described it in what you just said about something greater than consensus reality,
hmm
which might include, like you said, grace, kindness, generosity. So, is there anything else you can say about exactly how you define the word spiritual or spirituality?
So in my book, I might reference my books just
Yes,
because
please
I
do.
can. And so I wrote a book called Cultivating Spirituality in Children, 101 Ways to Make Our Children, Support Our Children into Soaring. And I did a really good description of spirituality in that. And the idea of that book was, hey, as parents, we need to integrate and know what and experience and live these concepts in order to bring about greater degrees of spirituality in our children. For me, spirituality is about living beyond what we know to be true, living beyond fear-based, factual consensus reality. So I talk about the paradigm shifts, which are paradigm shift. We have to have a paradigm that's greater than what we're living in. And so many of us know that we have that, but we don't actually engage in it in an intelligent way.
Mm.
That makes sense. In an engaged way. We go to church or we do meditation, but in terms of really focusing on and expanding that relationship with our spirit self, most of us ignore that. So I think of sexuality, sensuality, spirituality. It's a quality of relationship with ourself,
Hmm.
our higher self that we, in a sense, know exists, but again, we take for granted or we ignore it to a greater degree.
Mm.
So I think those who are I think spiritual intelligence is cultivating that relationship, that openness, that expansion to greater and greater degrees of knowing from that divine, what I call divine or universal source of all that is, the isness, the oneness of that. Now we can do that in terms of seeing universal intelligence, but then there's the question, and I don't really care if it's divine intelligence, sacred developed intelligence, or just intelligence. It doesn't matter. But my experience is that of expanding our awareness to include more and more of that. I started I've read The Alchemist a couple of times, and been drawn to go back to the Alchemist. And I'm listening to it on Audibles, and it is so in alignment with that, the knowingness of the wisdom of the soul of the earth, the soul of the universe, the soul of all of us, and the oneness of that. The whole book is about that. And that's like, yes, that's what I'm talking about, is the knowing and living into the knowingness of life, the big L life.
Yes. So 2 questions come to mind in response to that very eloquent explanation. One is, you mentioned the higher self, and you also mentioned all that is, the universal intelligence. To you, is there a distinction between the higher self and the universal intelligence, all that is, or is the higher self that?
I think it's the both and it's one of those, again, tricky places that doesn't need to be argued. It's just how people see it. And so, for instance, when I've got in my perspective, I have angels and I have guides, and I have a higher wisdom self. And I may have, in the Christian tradition, there's a Holy Spirit, and then there's Jesus, and there's universal, we'll call it God. And so there's levels of vibration. And so me in this body, I've been working at elevating my level of consciousness and my level of vibration, which then makes me more aware of and attuned to other aspects of reality. Perhaps seeing elementals. Some people can see elementals or fairies or trees talking, or those kinds of concepts, or intuitiveness. Creativity is something that is just is in essence who we are as creative. So as I raise my vibration in elevation and consciousness, then I have more and more access to these, I think, call them higher or greater levels of universal oneness. So for me, it's the same, and there may be, from what other people say, it's like, oh yeah, that the Holy Spirit, or in the Kabbalah, you've got the Holy Spirit, which is in a sense the guy that'll talk to the higher ones for you, because it's said that I don't necessarily have the capacity to speak to or communicate with those higher realms. So it doesn't matter to me what somebody believes or what's true. It doesn't, but it's just that I think I can relate to my higher self.
I see. That's really interesting.
I could kind of sort of relate to a Holy Spirit part. I mean, it was part of my upbringing as a Catholic, but very different way. And then the rest of it is, as I'm, like I said, elevating, then I have greater capacity to of a sense of knowing in that, and reaching out myself that way. Does that make sense?
It does. I'm really just processing that. It's really interesting. Something that just stood out to me is the acknowledgement of a plurality of spiritual practices and traditions and perspectives, and how spiritual intelligence can express itself through any of those different approaches to spirituality, whatever exactly the belief system is. Generally, it's true that all of these so-called spiritual perspectives are similar in the way that they are focused on something greater than the mortal body, I suppose. That's you could say.
That's right.
And so that's beautiful to me, that spiritual intelligence can basically kind of fuel whatever the person's spirituality is, however different it may look from other people's spirituality. That's interesting, and it's very inclusive, and that seems true to me.
Thank you. If you think about all religions or spiritual traditions started with somebody who had an experience of knowing. This experience that said, I had this experience and I have this knowing that occurred because of that.
Mm.
And because of that, these different paths were evolved towards this greater knowing of something divine.
Yes.
And it's just, that's what's true. And then the dogma of religious practices, or the religious rules and regulations and dogmas that constrain and constrict one's ability. So for instance, growing up Catholic, we weren't allowed to talk to God. We prayed, but we weren't allowed to have that one-on-one conversation. We had to talk through a priest. The priest was that intercessory person thing. So it was like, at one point I went, what's the point of that? Well, I don't want to go to confession and tell this guy. I'm going to tell God. What's the point, right? So I started having that, just because I decided that was what I wanted to do. And the point where we can defer to no one, my spiritual, like what we're having this conversation, a lot of people might argue or say, she doesn't know what she's talking about or whatever, and it doesn't matter to me. This is my experience, and this is the way that I frame my truth so that it's mine, how I hold it. And I'm totally open to supporting and empowering people to discover and find theirs. That's why I do the work I do.
And I think that highlights maybe the distinction between spirituality and religion. Although religion can be full of spirituality, spirituality can be separated from religion. And perhaps this is one of the signature ways in which it can separate itself, is in the way that it is very personal, and it can be interpreted and designed however it's meaningful to the individual.
That's right.
Interesting. So let me ask you this. What would you say to someone who would identify themselves as being secular, or who, is atheist even? How, if they were to wonder whether spiritual intelligence was relevant to them, how might it look for someone who doesn't really have a belief structure of much existing beyond what the senses can detect?
So, that kind of question isn't important to me. I'll say it that way. Okay. Unless the person is like wanting something. Okay. And not just the intellectual conversation or the intellectual bantering or opinionating process of that. Like, what's the point in that? If they're trying to get something by thinking they're smarter or whatever, that isn't of interest to me. What's important to me is that if somebody was asking me those questions, so as we've mentioned, I'm a transformational life coach. And so one of the things I know to be true is that everybody wants something from every conversation. Okay. So if a person says, well, I'm an atheist, or I have this, what's the point of this spiritual, and am I, trying to, where does that play a part in my life? Now I can say, well, what is it that you want from this conversation? What is that? And in doing that, now I'm bringing it into a personal conversation. What do they want? As opposed to they're trying to get something, like being smart, or get me off my ground or my game. But like, what is it you want by asking that question? And now we're going to have a real conversation. It's like, well, I don't believe. It's like, okay, great. But what's, for me, the starting point of most of our relationship with our spirit self is the point where we have to have a leap of faith. Like, something's happening, and at some point I don't know the answers. I don't know what to do. I'm out of control, or I'm in a lot of pain, or a lot of loss, or a lot of grief. Something that takes me out of my, again, my consensus reality. And it's like, I don't know what to do. I'm going to have to turn it over.
Mm-hmm.
Is a moment of faith.
Hmm.
And even if it's like, I got to turn this over to Nick, okay, or I got to turn this over to a therapist, or I got to turn this over to a doctor.
Mm-hmm.
There's that point where our human abilities have come to, in this moment, a hard stop. And now something has to shift. The 12-step program is all about letting go and letting God. Admitting powerlessness is step one. I admit that I'm powerless essentially over people, places, and things. It says I'm powerless over my addictions, but my addictions are all based on what I think about people, places, and things, right? That's all it is. It's interpretations. I'm powerless over my interpretations of people, places, and things. Step number two is come to admit that there is a power greater than myself, that if I turn my stuff over to them will restore me to sanity. Now, that might be a doctor or a therapist or a coach or a health practitioner or a friend or a lover or a child or a pet. But there's that point where we do something that's a shift from personal power to using our personal power and turning it over. So every single person has that experience, everyone. And we just don't know the degree to which we're doing that. Does that make sense?
It does. It does. And it puts some clarity around the idea of faith. And it makes faith, I think, relatable to more people. When you
Mm-hmm.
think of it in that way, realizing that I've reached the limits of my abilities and my personal power. And so I need to reach beyond that. And I don't know exactly what I'm reaching for even, or
Beautiful.
how it will support me. But
That's right.
the faith is in the reach beyond. So to me, that makes sense in an interesting way, because actually faith has always been a somewhat difficult concept for me, I suppose.
Uh-huh.
And so this resonates more.
Yeah.
So I like it. Okay.
So two things I want to say about
Yes.
that is, one thing is, in this time of the COVID, incredible amount of uncertainty.
Mhm.
And what do we do when life is uncertain? How do we respond to the uncertainties of life? And some of us do that in all different kinds of ways. We all have our strategies for dealing with uncertainty, whether it's drinking or relationships or pets or eating or meditation or walking in nature. We all have our ways of dealing with uncertainty. And the ways that we be with uncertainty are all, I'm going to say, faith-based. Because if I say, I'm going to feel better if I go outside, I'm turning that over so that I feel better and I go outside in nature. Okay. That's faith-based. Or I'm going to take all my money out of the stock market and put it in the bank. That's faith-based.
Mm-hmm.
That's going to make me feel better. That's faith-based. So we're either faith-based based on, I got to go get a job, or I got to get more money, or I got to get unemployment, or I got to go to the doctor. It's all faith-based, but it's where we're choosing to put our faith. The other thing I was going to say is David Hawkins, one of my favorite people in the world. It's not on the planet anymore. He
Mm-hmm.
said faith is, his definition was a voluntary suspension of disbelief.
A voluntary suspension of disbelief. Hmm.
Now, it's also could be other way, voluntary suspension of belief,
True.
right?
Yes.
Most of us believe in the consensus reality. I use that as sort of a general term for, this is how we do the world.
Mm-hmm.
This is, and so if we voluntarily suspend that belief in that structure, then, oh my God, now I'm in a different paradigm, basically.
Mm.
Faith.
Hmm.
Unknown, uncertainty, the rest of it.
This reminds me, I was just having a really good conversation with my wife and a couple of friends, and the topic of faith came up, and we were raising the words faith and belief and knowing,
Mm-hmm.
and how if you know something, you don't have to believe it or have faith in it. if you believe something, that seems to mean something slightly different from knowing it, because there's an element of not knowing in a
Mhm.
belief, but it's also different from faith because you have some sort of conclusion or expectation set in place.
Mhm.
But that faith is perhaps the farthest out. It's truly the farthest from knowing. You
That's right.
really don't know. It's based in uncertainty, like you said, and yet it is doing things without knowing what's going to happen, I suppose.
Mhm.
Hmm.
You've decided. Um, I mean, it's like we have faith that we go to work, we'll get paid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, that people, we have faith that our bosses will honor their word and pay us or do whatever. That level of promise and agreements and all of those things are all faith based. When we're driving down the highway, we have faith that people will stay in their lane and be mindful of. So all of these places where we utilize faith, but we don't see it the same way
Right. We don't see it the
until
same way.
until until it is questioned.
Mm.
and
Yeah.
and that's my job as a transformational life coach, is to question people's reality, to be their thinking partner, to
Yeah.
say, so where's that come from? You know, how do you do that? Or how do you do faith, or all of those things?
Hmm.
But my questions only are in alignment with what you want. What is it you want? Okay. And to get what you want, 90% of people have to take a leap of faith, because they have
Yes.
to let go of what they believe to be true, or what's, you know, the reality. I was talking to a woman yesterday. I'm part of a group, facilitate a group, and she was at the lake, you know, Lake Tahoe or whatever, and beautiful woods. Now she comes back home to San Francisco, and she goes, now I'm back in reality. You know, I'm really immersed in this COVID thing. I go, wait a second, which is really reality?
Mm.
What's your reality? Because I live on Orcas Island, and if you look around,
Mm.
right, this is my reality.
Yes.
There's 14 people in all of San Juan County, where I live, that have had COVID. This is my reality.
Mm.
So what is reality? And are you willing to look at it differently so that you can perhaps have a reality that's more peaceful, even with the COVID situation going on?
Hmm.
And those are the questions, like, do you want a different reality, or do you want to live in the of it all? What is it that you want?
Hmm. You know, this reminds me, in your book, Self-Empowerment 101, that's the one that I read much of.
Uh-huh.
And
Thank you.
you talk about decoding, which is a word I really like, actually. Decoding beliefs that interfere with manifesting the life you want.
Hmm.
And I think you just gave a good example of a belief that can be decoded, or
Hmm.
a habit of thinking that
Hmm.
needs to be examined. In,
Hmm.
for example, talking about the reality of being in a city as being more real, as being like the reality, even though you just stepped out of nature, ancient nature.
That's
Um,
right.
so, can you say a little bit more about maybe even one more example of a belief that can interfere with manifesting the life you want?
Okay. When you're in a state of no data, like everything in consensus reality is all data based. But what if you erase your data? What's left? What's left, Nick?
This is a good question.
Yeah,
The word that comes to my mind is just consciousness.
that's right.
That's part of my understanding of life.
And consciousness, then what is occurring within that consciousness? What would you experience?
Hmm.
No data in that consciousness, what would you experience?
Hmm.
What's your sense or your imagining?
Pure light.
Okay.
That's what I imagine.
And as you're experiencing that pure light, what's the experience? What's the quality of the experience of this consciousness, this pure light? What's it like in you as you're having this experience?
Perfection.
Okay. And in that perfection, your experience is what? If you're experiencing perfection, what is that state of being?
Complete.
Okay. What else? Is there wholeness? Is there love? Is there, or is it just just a big?
Like that. It's like that.
Okay.
Almost like I can't even say another word beyond complete because complete is
Excellent.
so complete.
Okay. So it's beyond language at that point.
Yeah.
Okay. So I asked a question from the point of paradigm, from the consensus reality. I just asked a question and you have an answer. You have a knowing of that. Bada bing, bada boom.
Mm. Yeah, thank you for that, making that more real for
Yeah.
me.
So my work basically uses 4 basic questions. You're getting a coaching training program right now. Okay.
Wow.
So I'd wave my wand and you go, hey, I want to be more conscious. Well, what do you have? I'll have a sense of completeness. Okay, great. What's in the way? That's what you want. We'll
Mm.
say, generally speaking, here's what I want. And I can ask a whole lot of questions like, what will that look like in your life? And how will that show up? How will you know? Okay. But what I want to know, because we'll just pretend we know all that, what's in the way of this consciousness, pure light, and completeness? What's in the way of that?
Hmm. I'm gathering this is not a rhetorical question.
No, it's not. A lot of people think it is. And we can move on. You go, let's move
I,
on. We can move
I,
on.
I'm with you.
Okay.
I'm engaging this. What's in the way? Hmm.
So by in essence, waving my magic wand and asking you these questions, boom, you're here.
Mm-hmm.
Boom, you're having the experience. What keeps that from being sustainable?
Problems to solve.
Beautiful. So put that in a full sentence. Problems to solve. What's the whole sentence or the whole thought?
The whole thought is that problems to solve prevent me from feeling a sense of total completion in my life.
Beautiful. Awesome. One single thing in essence keeps you're this far away from this.
Hmm.
Okay. So that's question number 2. Well, question 1, what do you want? Number 2, what's in the way? Problems to solve. Question 3, what needs to shift? What needs to shift so that you have this level of consciousness, this level of pure light and completeness?
The problems need to be solved.
Okay.
But I'm aware that there will always be more problems. There will always be issues that need to be addressed by humans.
Okay.
And yet I'm okay without that sense of completion
Okay.
because the effort to help solve problems is so meaningful
Great.
that that itself gives me a sense of fulfillment, if not completion.
Lovely. Beautiful. So in essence, you're more dedicated in this lifetime to that work and that fulfillment than being in this state of enlightenment.
That's a great way to put it.
And
That
it's
feels
good
true.
to know, right? It's
That
just
is
good
good
to
to know.
know. Yeah. So you have a commitment to enlightenment, but you have this other commitment and dedication and the sense of passion and fulfillment that I'm hearing that says, no, this is actually the higher commitment for me right now. Awesome.
There's a little shift there. That's really helpful because the shift I'm experiencing is being at peace with that.
Beautiful.
Being at peace with my very ambitious personality, being at peace with knowing that I will always be seeking a problem to solve or trying to create something valuable for people.
Yep. Beautiful. And you are now at choice about that
Mm,
more so.
yes.
And the part of you, I'm going to make this assumption, the part of you that has not been able to be at peace about that is I should want
Mm.
enlightenment, or I should. And that's part of that consensus reality. Like, I'm not okay if I'm doing this and not wanting that. Okay.
Yeah.
So that's all part of that consensus conversation within the consensus reality. But if we say, okay, I don't need to feel guilty or shame or anything. I'm at peace right now about I'm loving this work,
Mm.
right?
Yes.
That's what it's about.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
I think that
So
was the best way for you to help me understand this work. Just a
okay.
little sample.
It's interesting because for me it's that human spirit connection.
Mm.
My vision statement, or when asked, what's the vision of the world for you? What is it you're wanting to do? What you're wanting to see in the world? That's our vision. My vision is the fulfillment of the human spirit. And so the fulfillment of the human spirit through the empowerment of every individual on the planet.
Mm.
That's my vision statement. So that's what I do, is I empower people by saying, hey, what do you want? You can have it. I'm your fairy godmother.
Yes.
And then you get to say, yeah, I want that. And really like this, I'm really happy right here. And it's like, or whatever that is. But the
Mhm.
fulfillment to bring, that's what the self-empowerment book is all about, is you can empower yourself to have it exactly how you want it.
Mm.
But part of that is seeing how our consensus view of reality constricts that possibility.
Understood.
Each and every
Mhm.
one of us is universal potentiality, 100%. And I'm responsible for what I do with that. And if I constrain myself with limited thinking based on what my upbringing told me, then I'm not open to the amazing capacities that just
Mhm.
show up. That's what, again, the alchemist is about. Things show up when you're in alignment with your heart's desire, when you have a sense of that.
Mm.
You have to be open to that rather than go. And most people will say, Rosie, what I want is blah blah blah, but I can't have it. It's too big or whatever. And they've just negated. And 99%, I think, of us do that, have that conversation. I want this, but
But
yeah.
I have two questions that are in my mind that feel like kind of big questions or challenging questions for you. The first one is I find myself thinking about spiritual bypassing.
Hmm.
And, I know you know what that is, but just to kind of say out loud, just this way of using spirituality to avoid real responsibilities and real emotional problems or relationship issues.
Hmm.
And I feel like I can see a way where someone who was just trying to maybe disconnect with a very real problem in the world or in their own life could just try to shift their paradigm in a way that just makes it so that they're not seeing it, but it's still real.
Hmm.
For example, if someone were to say, I don't want to live in a world with injustice, so I'm going to stop believing that there is injustice. That would, of course, be a way of breaking from consensus reality that feels not like you're rising above it, but sort of falling below seeing it.
Hmm.
So I'm wondering if you can just respond to that. How can we keep people anchored in what really is real and yet also open to universal potentiality?
Like you say, that's a really difficult question. Um, there are, I want to first address that there are spiritual bypasses, but there are people who use intellectualization as a bypass.
True.
There are people who use emotionalization as
Mm,
bypasses. Okay. So that's just part of that. So it's just interesting that even because of dealing more in the spirit with people who are more on the spiritual part of the continuum, that happens to be the, I'm not, it doesn't exist because it doesn't exist.
mm,
But it, in a sense, that when we look around me and there isn't the COVID trauma drama where I live in, to the degree that it is someplace else, my reality is this. Your reality is something else.
mhm.
Somebody in New York City working in the hospital, that's a different reality. Those are different realities. So I can't say that reality doesn't exist, but it isn't the one that I'm living in. It's like different channels on a TV or a radio
Yes.
or YouTube channels. Okay. It's like, well, my channel has me watching aquariums and fish things, somebody else's reality. So that's part of the challenge, right? How I choose to be with those different realities is, I think, the challenge, the injustice. Am I turning my back? Am I ignoring it? Or am I working on myself in a way that shifts the vibration of it all? Because in a sense, when we do our own work, we're doing the work of the world. And sometimes that's hard for people. I love that there are people in the world that do social justice work, because they're doing social justice work. They can do it in the world. I don't operate that way. I do personal justice work. When I'm dealing with the injustices in my own life in a way that is honoring of all of it and respecting, that shifts the vibration and the resonance and the consciousness level of the whole world.
That makes sense.
So I don't watch news programs. I don't want to hear anything about the politics, because there's an insanity that skews me. Okay. I don't like that feeling. It doesn't help, doesn't solve anything for me, and it doesn't bring me to another level of higher consciousness. Doesn't. So some people will say, well, that's a spiritual bypass. It's like, no, I'm doing my work in a different way.
Makes sense.
So if somebody was coming in and saying, hey, I want to do something about social justice. Okay, so what's that look like for you? Well, I don't want to go out and be in protests. I don't want to, and I don't want to. Okay, great. That totally makes sense to me, because I don't want to, right? Or if somebody said, I want to be on the front lines, and I go, excellent. How do we make that happen, right? And so either way, it's like, how do we make that happen? Where's your way? Like we started out this conversation, every one of us has our own way of doing and being this human spirit. So a lot of people do take spiritual bypasses. Some people take political bypasses or economical bypasses or whatever it is, so they don't have to, and they can ignore and avoid their own anxieties, own hurt, feelings, brokenness, all of that. I'll do it all the time.
Makes a lot of sense to me. I know I've said the words "make sense" 5 times in the last 3 minutes, but I meant it every time. And I guess, yeah, it's interesting to think about how we can take many routes to bypass what we don't want to experience or address. Maybe spirituality is an especially popular one because it's so appealing in many ways and just empowering to think about and practice. But it's true, you're right, that we can take bypass routes in many ways. Okay, the other question I wanted to raise to you was just about the topic of free will. And something I know you've written about is accountability and responsibility. So, and to me, just to share a little bit of a background where I'm coming from here, I see free will as inseparable from responsibility, because if you believe in determinism, that we don't have any free will and that everything we do and think and say is caused by impersonal factors, then you really can't be held accountable for anything you do because it wasn't your choice, really. But if you are free, if there is some degree to which we can choose our thoughts, words, and deeds, then we are responsible for them because we were free to do otherwise. So I raised that just to express, that thought, and also just to hear your understanding of free will.
In 2010, I had a spiritual immersion, what I call a spiritual immersion. Is life changed, and I went down into a huge process, dark night of the soul, all of those kinds of things. And through all that process, I could get to higher and higher levels of consciousness, coming out of the darkness. And I realized if I did some activities, that kind of took me down. But if I did other things, it would take me back up. So I'm at free will. So it's like, wait, I want more of that. And I still like hot dogs, or I still like, but I'm at free will. There's no Nobody's judging me for that. It's like loving parents who put their kids in a sandbox and they're doing stuff and they get dirty and all that stuff. And they're going, ah, that's what they're here to do. And I love that because I felt that made me feel so much more okay about choosing what I choose. And it's not a sin that I'm going to go to hell for. It's like, oh, that didn't feel good when I did that. I'm not going to do it again, or I'm going to try not to do it again, or I'm not going to do it as often. But that for me is that free will place. And the greater degree of expansion and ascension I experience, the more I want to choose that. It's part of my free will.
Mm.
So
Yes.
that's my say on that.
Well said. And I think it's important to highlight the interesting, I don't know if it's a paradox or just dynamic, that you are free, but the only thing you're not free from is the consequences of those free choices you made.
That's right. Isn't that great?
Yeah.
That's great. There's all these analogies, the butterfly, the caterpillar, the butterfly, those kinds of things. But that quite often the transformative experience is based on years or lifetimes of processing that brings about, bada bing, bada boom. Oh my God, I had this experience, right? So quite often, and in my experience too, is a lot of underground work, a lot of processing, a lot of stuff happening, and then all of a sudden, wow, here's transformation. So my work as a transformational coach is more of a steward than it is and I call it an agent of transformation, because this process can be grueling. This process is not about, oh, let me help you have this transformational experience. This is hard, grueling work to create this reality. Because most people want transformation. This is a blog I wrote. It's on my website. People want transformation. They just don't want to change, right? If you're transformed, if you have a transformational experience, a lot of people have spiritually transformative experiences, either through near death or whatever. And it's like, what do? You're transformed. Now you're in a different paradigm. And it's like, I don't know, again, uncertainty and just a different reality if you're transformed.
Right.
You're in a different reality. The caterpillar knows how to do caterpillar, doesn't know how to do butterfly, right? What do you do?
Right.
Most people will collapse or get depressed, go back, find their way back to consensus reality, that kind of stuff. Because they don't have a context. They haven't developed that.
That's it.
Yeah.
I just, not to interject or interrupt, but the context, that's so important to me. And that is one way I believe that our general mental health field is failing people, is that they don't bring the framework of transformation into people's suffering.
That's right.
We are so, like, whoever is using the DSM and making very quick diagnoses is overlooking the possibility that this person might be amidst a transformation, that there's absolutely nothing wrong with them or their brain, and that this disorder might be in the service of higher order.
That's right.
If we don't see it like that, it literally prevents, I think, how many people actually go through that. And like you said, they kind of revert back to maladaptive coping mechanisms or new maladaptive coping mechanisms, or anything that just makes the symptoms go away.
That's right.
Without, I guess, growing through them.
People aren't seen in their wholeness, in their sacredness, their divineness. They're seen in their broken pathology. So that's what I love about my work is, and that's what I love about, one of the things I love about me is that I get to see people, because I was able to learn how to see people in their wholeness, in their brilliance, in their intelligence that's already there. I don't have to cultivate intelligence. You got it.
Beautiful. Yes. That reminds me, one of the quotes that like sticks in my mind is Carl Rogers' definition of unconditional positive regard. The definition that he offered was seeing someone as having within him or herself vast resources for self-understanding, for altering his or her self-concept, attitudes, and self-directed behavior, and that this Yet these resources can be tapped if only a climate of facilitative psychological attitudes can be provided.
Yeah.
And I feel like you do that. You
Thank you.
provide facilitative psychological attitudes with your acceptance and empowering attitudes that helped me just now and help people tap their own resources.
That's right.
So
That's
thank
right.
you so much for this amazing work, really.
You're
And
welcome.
I really feel grateful that I got to sample it today.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah.
Gosh, well, if I didn't wait till the last day to go pay my taxes, I would be able to continue this conversation for even longer. I know you have a client coming up too, though. So thank you so much for a really meaningful, fun, and insightful conversation.
You're very welcome. And
Okay.
I really appreciate, I have to say that you make it easy to have this conversation to this degree. So
Mm,
thank you for that. Your listening is really beautiful. Your presence is really
mm.
beautiful. So
Wow,
that
makes
helps a
me feel
lot.
good.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you for expressing that.
If you like this video and you want to see more, please subscribe.